Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third and final meeting of our series, which we have organized over the past week, and which is dedicated to the world's middle powers, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, South Africa, and what they think about the emerging global order. My name is Pawel Zerka. I know very little about any of the countries in question, but I do know a lot about numbers and public opinion polling, and therefore I will use the results of ECFR's latest public opinion polling, which we conducted in 11 countries in Europe, as well as 10 countries outside Europe. And I will use it as a starting point for a discussion about the global perceptions of the world order. Last week, we explored Saudi Arabia and Turkey, two countries that are fond of practicing a sort of a multi-vector diplomacy. And now I invite you to spend the next 30 minutes talking about South Africa. We are lucky to have with us a renowned political scientist, Adebayo Olukoshi, who is ECFR's visiting fellow, and who in the past served as a director of the UN African Institute for Economic Development and Planning. We are also joined by my well-traveled colleague, Theo Murphy, who heads ECFR's Africa program. The ambitious plan is to end this conversation in less than half an hour, with 3 sessions, each of them lasting 10 minutes. First, a data insights round with me, then an analysis round with Adebayo and Theo, and finally, questions and answers from you, the audience. Let me encourage you to ask your questions in the chat early on, because we don't have that much time for this conversation. And if you have enjoyed this series, or have ideas how to improve it, then just pop me an email. But now, as promised, let me share with you a couple of slides. And I hope that they soon appear on your screens. Here we go. So those who have attended our 2 previous discussions may already be familiar with this graph, which shows that South Africa is a good example of what my colleagues Mark Leonard, Ivan Krastev, and Timothy Gertonash call an a la carte world. As you can see by looking at the blue side of this pie chart, 2/3 of respondents in South Africa believe that it is realistically possible for the country to have good relations with both China and the US. And only 26%, the red part, believe that this is not possible. Such a perspective is shared in many other places too. But South Africa, alongside Saudi Arabia and Indonesia, are the places where such a feeling is the most widespread. Still, if South Africans were forced to choose between being part of an American or a Chinese bloc, they would really struggle. Only a slight majority would choose the US. This is the blue part of the pie chart, but almost 40% would go with China. On this, South Africa is very similar to Saudi Arabia, but different from countries like Indonesia or Turkey, not to mention Brazil or India, where the appetite for going with China rather than with the US is much weaker. China has a lot of economic allure for South Africans. Majorities would be happy for Chinese companies to be present in their country and to build infrastructure, buy a tech company, or invest in the media sector. However, many South Africans would have a preference for China rather than the US also in other fields, including internet governance and security cooperation, where over 1/3 of respondents are saying that they would choose China and not the US. And it's perhaps on that last point of security cooperation where numbers look the most striking to me. In no other country in our sample, except for Russia, are there as many people as in South Africa eager to work with China on security matters. So just to explain this graph, 37% in South Africa would prefer to work with China rather than the US on this point, which is not that much less than 48% that would choose working with the US on security matters. And there are surely various explanations behind it, which I'm keen to hear from Theo and Adebayo. But let me just flag to you one final slide, which shows important divides by age on this point. South Africa, as far as I know, is a very young country of young people, with roughly 2/3 of its inhabitants having less than 35 years. And those who are under 35 also tend to be more attracted to China than their parents or grandparents. So I would be keen to learn why this is so from Theo and Adebayo. And so let me turn to you, first to Adebayo, then to Theo. And I would also be keen to ask you more broadly if the a la carte world, as explained here, is more of a threat or perhaps of an opportunity to South Africa. Over to you, Adebayo.
Thank you very much indeed. These are intriguing results, which you have shared with us, Pawel. But I think it's also broadly reflective of the political coloration within South Africa in the ruling African National Congress. If we were to look a bit deeper into the political leanings of your respondents, I would not be surprised that a good number of those who are favorably open to China are also somewhat leaning towards the ruling African National Congress, which, as you know, in terms of its history as a liberation movement, enjoyed broad support outside of the collective West from places like the defunct Soviet Union and to some extent China. And more importantly, in terms of being the party of government, you know that the ANC has been very keen since it joined the BRICS organization that involves China, Brazil, India, and others in pushing an agenda towards alternative platforms for global diplomacy and engagement. So I would argue that the results you have shared with us are reflective of the internal debates and policy orientation. But it's also a season of uncertainty in international relations. A lot of things are changing at a fairly rapid pace. South Africa is one of those countries on the African continent which is part of the dynamic of change in a visible way, G20, BRICS, and the like, and prides itself with being the representative of Africa in the emerging New World Order, which is basically an order that, as it sees it, provides a much greater opportunity for the countries of the continent to have greater voice and presence than they have had in the existing order. And to that extent, I would not be surprised at all that there is a broad leaning and openness to other centers of power and influence in the international system, not only amongst middle powers themselves, South Africa and its relationship with the countries of the Gulf, with Saudi Arabia, with Brazil and others, Indonesia, India, but also with big and emerging powers like China, is as much as an important source of economic empowerment in terms of the kinds of possibilities that China offers in the economic arena, but also a strategic political ally in driving reform or change in the international system.
Thanks, Adebayo. I immediately have thousands of questions, but before I ask them, let me go to Theo first so that he can have his reaction first.
Look, I agree very much with Adebayo's take. I was also just recently in South Africa on a bit of a listening tour, and the message came through loud and clear that an a la carte world, as you've described it, is something that South Africa and Africa writ large can benefit from enormously. So up until now, changing global order in Africa brings two things. It brings the specter of the historical trauma from the Cold War, where that Cold War was very hot and bloody as it was fought out via proxies in Africa. So there's a sort of distant fear and aversion to what might come. But until that new reality materializes, and if it does, because that is not written in stone, other permutations are fully possible. The changes that we're experiencing in global order are meaning more options for Africa. So competition turns Africa into something that is more valuable to different partners. And I think, you know, the strongest sentiment that you'll find among South African elites, also in other places in Africa, is that this is a great moment for Africa to advance its own principal goals, which are really all about economic development. Using this moment, most importantly, using the access and the interest to a wide variety of partners to help them make this jump into economic development, which would make Africa just, an infinitely stronger player on the international stage. So it's about China and the US, yes, but it's really, as Adebayo said, about a range of other middle powers that are getting increasingly engaged in Africa. So South Africa is interesting because, as Adebayo said, definitely a prominent middle power in the world, the most prominent in Africa, but middle powers around Africa are also engaging, with incredible new vigor on the security front, but also on the economic front in Africa. So there's a relationship between the middle powers in Africa that's analogous to the interest of both the great powers, US and China.
Can you clarify which other powers do you mean?
Yeah, it tends to be ruled a little bit by geography. So I mentioned very briefly the Gulf. We can be more specific there in talking about Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, also Qatar. Outside the Gulf, but also an important middle power, is Turkey. And sometimes from Africa, these are viewed as kind of a basket. So the Gulf has been involved before global order started to unravel in the area of Africa most proximate to it. That's the Horn of Africa. It's just across the Red Sea for it. So that's seen as part of its kind of strategic backyard and needs to be protected from a security point of view. But since then, as we move into renewable energy and the green transition, the Gulf has become incredibly active in bringing investments in that sphere to all different parts of Africa. So it's important to note that the security thing for the Gulf is about proximity. It's about East Africa. But Africa as an opportunity in the green transition and as a place for investment, they take a much more expansive geographic view. They're much further afield than from their kind of strategic hinterland, if you accept that term, for the Horn.
If I could start with the questions round, so I encourage the audience to ask questions in the chat. I will start with one. So you referred to South Africa as having the as trying to position itself as a representative of Africa in those various formats, as well as in the emerging global order. Could you tell us a little bit about the limitations of South Africa as a representative of the African continent?
Adebayo, do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, no, I mean it's true that historically, being a voice for Africa, there has been a succession of countries in the period since independence in 1960 for period after independence, which was the first country in Black Africa, so to speak, to gain independence in 1957. The Sudan gained independence in 1956. But for most people, actually, in their imagination, Ghana was the first country to gain independence, which is not completely correct, but it's reflective of the leadership role which Ghana came to occupy for a prolonged period as a champion of Pan-Africanism, but also as a champion of African liberation, serving as a voice and a rallying point simultaneously. That mantle, I would argue, subsequently moved on in the context of the liberation in Southern Africa, more specifically, to Tanzania under the leadership of Julius Nyerere. And just note here that it was not really a question of either the demographic weight or the economic strength of the countries that assumed this leadership position at different phases in time. But Tanzania under Nyerere became the headquarters of the African Organization of African Unity's Liberation Committee, and also home to many of the bases, military bases that were set up by the liberation movements of Southern Africa, to a point where Tanzania became, alongside Nigeria, recognized as frontline states in the final push against colonialism on the African continent in Southern Africa. Following the end of apartheid in South Africa and the election of Nelson Mandela as the first democratically elected leader of that country, both the charisma of Mandela and the potentiality of South Africa as easily the most industrialized country on the continent, but also with its overall economic positioning. For a period of time, South Africa took up moral and political leadership, serving as a voice for the continent at a time when its closest competitor, so to speak, Nigeria, was under military rule. And not just any type of military rule, but the Abacha military administration that had become a pariah among states, even within Africa, for its excesses on various fronts. And I think it is partly on account of those credentials, the strength of its institutions, its relative economic strength, alternating between Nigeria and itself as the biggest economy on the continent, and the legacy of Mandela, that South Africa is generally regarded by other actors in the international system as both a stable and credible partner to engage with. And the South African government has itself been quite conscious of the fact that it has a responsibility not just to project South African interest in such fora as the G20 or within BRICS, but also to rally Africa and serve as a voice and a representative for Africa in the global fora where it is the lone African country represented. So don't be surprised. BRICS Summit took place recently, about 2 months ago, hosted by South Africa, and South Africa invited African presidents. Practically every African president was invited to be a guest of South Africa at the BRICS Summit, even before the opening up of membership to countries like Ethiopia. So the challenge to South Africa's leadership, I would argue, are mostly going to be a function of its own internal challenges more than any serious external competition against a leadership role in a context in which a division of responsibilities is also emerging as a practice within the African Union, in which different countries are assigned different different roles in African international relations.
Thanks, Adebayo. And Theo, how do you read this? Do you think that South Africa succeeds in rallying the rest of Africa and in representing it in international fora? And do you feel that the fact that Ethiopia is joining the extended BRICS, does it mean a stronger African voice or more competition when it comes to the African voice?
There's two sides to this. There's how the external world engages with South Africa, and then how Africa engages with it. I think the external world is very, very happy to have one country that can be its interlocutor amongst 54 countries of Africa. And you see that, as Adebayo said, South Africa is represented very strongly in international fora. But I think South Africa needs to tread a little bit carefully as well internally, because although its particular history and its political orientation resonate well with many African countries, South Africa speaking on their behalf is a little difficult. Now, that can work, but there has to be the proper internal inter-African consultation and consensus before South Africa can do that. And this is something that's a bit of a perennial challenge for Africa. The time it takes for those 54 countries to get together, the mechanisms in which that can happen takes place only once a year. And so there's a bit of a disconnect between the proper way for consensus to be formed and then South Africa being asked on a regular basis, be it in the G20 or in the BRICS or somewhere else, to speak on behalf of Africa. So I think this creates a little bit of friction sometimes, not intentional from either side. It's just because the process isn't quite there.
Yeah, let me ask a question from the chat where one of the spectators is asking about South Africa's mediation role, especially in conflicts in its neighborhood. What are the motivations behind it, and what does it tell us about the role that South Africa wants to play? And if I can already ask you another question, and then we will shortly need to finish. And since we are a European Council on Foreign Relations, I am obviously interested in understanding where is Europe in all of this. So we discussed the presence of China, the US, as well as other players from the Gulf or Turkey in Africa. But I wonder, is there any, so of course there is a colonial legacy, but does this colonial legacy mean that working closer with Europe is a no-go for most African countries? Simply they are not interested and Europe is not attractive or not credible? Or is it also a misleading perception and actually Africa should be treated as a place where Europeans still have a lot of room to develop closer relationships? So I'm not sure which of you wants to start first, but those two questions about mediation and about Europe.
I'll say something brief about this, but I think Adebayo can expand on a lot. Again, there's a kind of internal, external facet to South Africa's role in mediation. Within Africa, I'd say South Africa is a sort of mediation superpower. And that's for two reasons. There's a guiding principle of African conflict resolution. It says African solutions to African problems, which means that even when external powers like the West and Europe are involved, it needs to be behind an African lead, and efforts exerted need to fall within a kind of guiding framework set out by Africa. So South Africa then, secondly, has its own historical experience to draw upon as a successful mediator. Well, the way that the apartheid struggle was eventually resolved through negotiations creates an incredible legitimacy. So you have South African figures on both sides of that negotiation who are now still very active in mediation within Africa. And you have institutions in South Africa, a kind of ecosystem around mediation has grown up there, which allows them to project out. I think they're more successful in Africa than outside of it. And I'm not sure how much Adebayo wants to say about the South African mediation effort towards Russia and Ukraine, but I think there was a little bit of international politics acting as a motivator there. And for that, you need to look at events before the Ukraine mediation from South Africa in South Africa, where this balancing act that the government had tried to strike between keeping all options open, including with Russia, but also keeping good relations with the US and Europe, had gotten a little bit out of line. And South Africa looked to be tilting towards the Russian side, particularly because of a high-profile arms shipment. And it seemed like the timing of the mediation effort in Ukraine followed rather closely on the heels of that, which led some people to conclude that it was about trying to make peace in the world, but it might also have been trying to recalibrate South Africa's equidistant relationships between all sides, which I think is a cornerstone of its approach to global order. Over to you, Adebayo.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think the record, insofar as the South African government is concerned with regard to mediation on the continent, is also, in addition to what you've said, you're partly conditioned by a concern, some would argue an excessive concern, not to be throwing its weight around. And so there is a lot which happens behind the scenes, don't ever make the headlines. In instances, for example, where South Africa is criticized for not being more open and direct, say on crisis in Lesotho or crisis in Swaziland or crisis in Zimbabwe. In fact, senior top-level South African officials are usually dispatched and sometimes spend weeks on the ground in each of those places, engaging with different actors quietly. We call it quiet diplomacy. And this was already started during the Mbeki years. Mandela was able to use his own personal charisma and authority to call up belligerents in an African conflict and more or less instruct them, a senior elder statesperson that he was, and gain their attention. But during the Mbeki years and to date, quiet diplomacy has been used side by side with the open conventional forms of mediation. So look at the crisis in Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, and the way in which South Africa responded to it, which some have criticized as being too slow, almost tardy, to a point of troops to help push back the advancement of the jihadi forces. South Africa preferred to go through the SADC organ on politics and conflict mediation as a way of responding to the crisis, even if I'm aware myself that dispatched very quietly people to Cabo Delgado in order to make an assessment of the situation and engage with the Mozambican government. With regard to the situation in Ukraine, I think, Theo, you are right. On the whole, the sentiment within the ruling ANC was kind of tilted on the side of Russia for historic reasons, right? The armed liberation struggle being heavily supported by the defunct Soviet Union, which Russia is seen as representing today. And a lot of the early cadres, military and civilian, of the ruling party were people who had some training, either civil or military, in Moscow and the former Soviet Union, and still maintain relations in that regard.
Yeah, there might perhaps still be a role. There might still be a role for South Africa to play in this, as we have seen with Zelensky's recent visit to Argentina. He's trying to rally a global support for his vision of how this war should end. I see that we won't have enough time to discuss where is Europe in all of this, but this is exactly what Theo and his program at ECFR are working on. So I think that I simply encourage you to follow our work on Africa and on the relations between Europe and Africa. For the moment, we need to end, and it's the end of this meeting, but also the end of our short series about middle powers. But if you have enjoyed this series, please let us know. And there are still a couple of countries that in the world that we could focus on the next episodes if we were to continue. And also, since we have been experimenting with this format of just 30-minute conversations, it would also be very useful to hear your feedback on whether this format really works, or does it leave too much appetite and too many unresolved questions to be useful at all. Anyway, for the moment, let me thank Theo and Adebayo for agreeing to join this conversation and for talking through that morning. I also thank a lot my wonderful colleagues Amanda Pope and Swansea Green, who masterminded this series. And now I need to simply say goodbye, and I wish all of you a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Pawel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.